Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to really get under the hood of those big, influential ideas and books. We pull out the core stuff, the essentials, just for you.
Basically your shortcut to being in the know.
Exactly. And this deep dive, like all our explorations, is brought to you by Ben's book summaries.
So today we're tackling a big one, The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. Really changed the conversation around how we live our daily lives, didn't it?
Absolutely. So our mission here is to unpack the key ideas, those sticky stories everyone mentions, and the bits you can actually use.
Right. By the time we're done, you should have a really good handle on the science of habits, how they work, and importantly, how you might change them.
Okay, let's dive in. Duhigg starts with this core concept, the habit loop. It's like the fundamental building block.
Yes, that three-step process. Cue, routine, reward. Seems simple on the surface.
Uh-huh. But the brain science behind it is pretty cool. He uses those rat maze experiments to show it.
Right. So picture this rat, new maze, trying to find the chocolate. Its brain is like firing on all cylinders, total concentration.
Thinking hard, trying to figure it out, but then after doing it over and over.
Exactly. The brain activity actually changes. It quiets down. The decision-making parts, they sort of take a back seat.
And this other part, the basal ganglia, it kicks in.
That's the key. It's an older part of the brain, handles automatic stuff. Think of it like your brain's autopilot. It takes over the routine.
So the rat isn't consciously choosing anymore. It's just running the maze, habit formed.
Precisely. It's efficient. Frees up the rest of the brain.
Which makes you think, how much of our day is run by this autopilot? And that story about Eugene Pauly, the guy with severe memory loss, that really drives it home.
Oh, yeah. Eugene's story is powerful. He couldn't form new memories, couldn't even remember he'd just eaten breakfast.
But he could still, find his way around the house, take his walks.
Exactly. His wife noticed he'd go for walks along the same route every day. Even though he couldn't consciously remember the route or why he was walking, the habit itself was stored, deep in that basal ganglia.
So the habit existed completely separate from his conscious memory. Wow.
It really shows how these routines can operate below the level of conscious thought. It's kind of unsettling, but also fascinating.
Definitely makes you look at your own routines differently. And what about those experiments where the reward turned bad? Like poison food for the mice?
Yeah, that's wild. They trained mice to follow a cue to get a reward. Then they made the reward unpleasant, poisoned it, or gave a shock.
You'd think the mice would stop, right? Survival instinct.
Logically, yes, and they would avoid the poisoned food if it was just sitting there. But when the cue for the habit appeared,
They still did the routine, even knowing the bad outcome.
they still pressed the lever. The habit was so ingrained it overrode the conscious knowledge of danger. That just shows the sheer power of these loops once they're established.
Okay, so that's the basic mechanics of a single habit. But then Duhigg brings in this idea of keystone habits. What are those about?
Keystone habits are kind of like foundational habits, the ones that, when they change, start a chain reaction. They spill over and transform other areas too.
Like knocking over the first domino.
Exactly. The book uses the story of Lisa Allen. She was in this study, and her initial goal wasn't even weight loss or anything broad.
Right, she focused just on quitting smoking, wasn't it?
Yes. And what happened was, as she focused intensely on breaking that one habit, other things started to shift. She started exercising more naturally, her eating habits improved, she managed her money better.
All stemming from tackling the smoking habit.
It seems so. Quitting smoking acted as the keystone, triggering wider positive changes. It reorganized other routines.
That's powerful. And it's not just personal, right? The Alcoa example shows this in a huge organization.
Oh, the Paul O'Neill story at Alcoa is classic. He takes over as CEO, and everyone expects him to talk profits, strategy.
And instead he talked about worker safety.
Yep. 0 injuries. That was his absolute top priority. Wall Street was baffled, like, what does this have to do with the bottom line?
Yeah, it sounds completely unrelated at first glance.
But O'Neill knew. He figured if he could change the habits around safety make, that the core focus it would force changes everywhere else.
How so?
Well, to achieve 0 injuries, you need better communication, right? Workers need to feel safe reporting problems. Processes have to be standardized and improved. You need better training.
So focusing on safety forced them to fix underlying systems and communication issues.
Exactly. And guess what? When safety improved, efficiency went up. Quality improved. Costs went down. Profits soared. Safety was the keystone habit that transformed the entire company culture and performance.
Amazing. It's about finding that one central thing that creates ripples, like Michael Phelps and his routines.
Absolutely. His coach, Bob Bowman, drilled these incredibly specific routines into him, not just physical, but mental too. The videotape visualization was key.
Putting in the videotape, what was that?
Before every race, even before bed sometimes, Phelps would mentally rehearse the perfect race. Every stroke, every turn, the finish, over and over, like watching a mental videotape of success.
So it became automatic.
So automatic that when he actually raced, it felt familiar, almost preordained. It reduced anxiety and let him perform under pressure. Bowman called these small wins, tiny routines that build confidence and make success feel inevitable.
And that helped him during that Olympic race where his goggles filled with water. He swam blind.
Incredible story, right? Middle of the 200-meter butterfly final, Olympics, goggles full of water, can't see a thing.
Nightmare scenario.
But because he'd rehearsed countless times, knew his stroke count between walls instinctively.
He just kept going,
Right.
based on the ingrained routine.
He nailed the turns, finished one gold, and broke the world record, swimming blind. All because those practiced routines, those habits, took over when conscious sight failed. That's the power of a deeply embedded habit.
Just incredible. Okay, so we see how habits work, the impact of keystones. What about making new habits? Duhigg really emphasizes cravings here.
Yes, the craving is crucial. It's not just cue routine reward. It's the anticipation of the reward, the craving for it, that really powers the loop.
And the Pepsodent story is the go-to example for creating a craving.
It really is. Back then, brushing teeth wasn't a widespread daily habit. Claude Hopkins, the advertising guy, needed to create a reason, a craving.
So he focused on tooth film, that slightly fuzzy feeling.
Exactly. He basically told people, hey, run your tongue over your teeth. Feel that film. It's unattractive. Pepsodent removes the film, gives you beautiful teeth.
Even though that film is pretty natural and maybe not the biggest deal health-wise.
Right. But he linked the cue, feeling the film, to a desired reward, beauty, a nice smile, and created a craving to get rid of the film. Genius, really.
And didn't they add something to make it foam or tingle?
Yes. Ingredients like mint oil and sodium lauryl sulfate. They didn't necessarily clean better, but they created that tingling, foaming sensation. That became an immediate sensory reward. Ah, it's working. My mouth feels clean. That feeling reinforced the habit.
Wow. Manufacturing a craving. But sometimes it doesn't work, like with Febreze initially.
Right. Febreze is the counterexample. P&G launched it to eliminate bad odors. Cue, bad smell. Routine, spray Febreze. Reward, no smell. Made perfect sense.
But it flopped at first.
Yeah. Turns out people who live with persistent bad smells, like lots of pets or smoking, often become noseblind to them. There was no strong craving to eliminate an odor they didn't really notice.
So the loop was logical, but the driving craving was missing for the target audience.
Exactly. The breakthrough came when they noticed people using it differently. This one woman, she cleaned a room spotless, then sprayed Febreze as a finishing touch.
Like a little celebration, a signal of completion.
Precisely. The reward she craved wasn't odor elimination. It was that feeling of, clean and finished, accompanied by a pleasant scent.
So they shifted the marketing.
Completely. They added more perfume, marketed it as the reward after cleaning. Spraying Febreze became the satisfying final step, and boom, huge success. They tapped into an existing craving for completion and freshness.
Fascinating. It's all about understanding that underlying desire. So if we want to change a habit, what's Duhigg's golden rule?
The golden rule is simple but powerful. Keep the same cue, provide the same reward, but insert a new routine.
Don't try to fight the cue or ignore the craving. Just swap out the behavior in the middle.
Exactly. Because the cue and reward are already wired in, it's easier to substitute the routine. The book uses Mandy and her nail-biting habit as an example.
Okay, how did that work?
First step, identify the cue. For Mandy, it was often a feeling of tension or boredom in her fingertips.
Right. And the reward wasn't tasting nails, it was.
Probably the brief physical stimulation, smoothing a rough edge, a momentary distraction. So, cue, tension. Routine, bite nails.
Yeah.
Reward, brief stimulation smoothing.
Got it. So the golden rule, keep the cue, keep the reward.
But change the routine. She learned a competing response. When she felt the cue, tension, instead of biting, she had to immediately put her hands in her pockets or clench her fist, make biting impossible.
Okay, that breaks the automatic action.
Then she needed to provide a similar reward. She was told to, say, rub her arm or knuckle quickly, something that gave a brief physical sensation, mimicking the old reward but without the nail biting.
So cue, tension, new routine, hands in pockets, then rub arm, reward, brief stimulation, and it worked.
Over time, yes. It takes practice, awareness, but it's a solid framework for change.
Makes sense. Okay, but changing habits isn't just about the loop, right? Willpower comes into play.
Definitely. Especially when you're first trying to override an old habit or build a new one. Duhigg talks about willpower being like a muscle.
It gets tired, but you can also strengthen it.
Kinda, yeah. Think of the famous marshmallow test with kids and delayed gratification. The initial take was some kids just had more willpower.
But later research showed it's more complex, like that radish and cookie study.
Right, Mervin's work. Students who had to resist tasty cookies and eat radishes instead. They gave up faster on a later difficult puzzle. It suggested using willpower on one task, depleted it for the next.
Like you have a limited tank of self-control juice.
That was the idea, yeah, that it's depletable in the short term. But other studies, like Oten and Chang's, offer a more hopeful view.
What did they find?
They found that people who consistently practice self-control in one area, like sticking to an exercise plan or a budget.
They got better at self-control overall in other unrelated areas.
Exactly. It's like exercising that willpower muscle in one domain strengthens it generally,
Mhm.
which is pretty encouraging if you're trying to build better habits.
So small, consistent efforts can build overall capacity. That's good news. And planning for when moments helps too, like those surgery patients.
Crucial point. Patients recovering from hip surgery who wrote down specific plans like, when I feel tired after lunch, I will immediately stand up and walk to the mailbox and back. They recovered faster.
They anticipated the pain point and pre-decided the action, an if-then plan.
Precisely. Planning for those moments of anticipated difficulty makes it much more likely you'll follow through when your willpower is low. Takes the decision out of the moment.
Starbucks uses this idea with their employee training, right? The Elite method.
Yeah, Starbucks invests heavily in training employees on how to handle stressful situations, like dealing with an angry customer. They give them routines, frameworks.
Ability, listen, acknowledge, take action, think, explain.
Right. And other frameworks too. It gives employees a pre-planned routine for tough moments, so they don't have to rely solely on in-the-moment willpower, which might fail under stress. It becomes a habit.
They're essentially building willpower habits, and the story of Travis Leach showed this could be life-changing for some employees.
Yeah, Travis had a tough background, struggled with self-control. The structure and routines Starbucks taught him really helped him succeed at work, and he said it spilled over positively into his personal life, too. Building those specific work habits strengthened his overall self-discipline.
It shows how organizations can actively cultivate this stuff.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. Social habits. How do our connections influence our habits?
Hugely. We're social creatures. Duhigg talks about Mark Granovetter's idea of weak ties.
Not your best friends, but acquaintances, friends of friends.
Exactly. And Granovetter found these weak ties are often more important for things like finding jobs or getting new information. They connect you to different social circles than your close friends who often know the same stuff you do.
Interesting. How does this relate to habit change or movements, like the civil rights movement?
Well, look at the Freedom Summer volunteers. The students most likely to actually go down to dangerous Mississippi were often those whose participation was known within their community, like their church group.
So the weak ties within the community created a kind of social expectation, a pressure to follow through.
Right. It wasn't just personal conviction. It was community knowledge and expectation reinforcing their commitment. And the Montgomery bus boycott that relied heavily on social habits and community ties. It wasn't just Rosa Parks. It was the whole community pulling together.
Absolutely. The boycott lasted over a year. That required intense coordination. Carpools, communication, mutual support, all facilitated by existing social networks, strong and weak ties. Participating became a community obligation, a powerful social habit. Not participating meant letting your neighbors down.
And Rick Warren used this at Saddleback Church with small groups.
Yeah, he understood that assigning members to small, regular meeting groups tapped into fundamental social needs. It turned church participation from an individual choice into a group habit, fostering connection and commitment. Making it social made it stick.
Makes sense. And Martin Luther King Jr., during the boycott, he didn't just organize, he instilled new social habits.
Yes, the habit of nonviolent resistance. It wasn't just a tactic, it became a shared identity, a new way of behaving together in the face of aggression. Loving your enemies, turning the other cheek, these became practiced social habits that defined the movement and empowered participants. They transformed followers into self-directing leaders enacting these new shared habits.
Wow. So social ties and shared routines are incredibly powerful drivers. What about habits inside organizations? Besides the safety thing at Alcoa?
Duhigg points out that organizational routines often act like truces. Different departments or people might have competing goals, and the established routines, how we do things here, provide stability, even if they're not always efficient. They prevent constant fighting over every little thing.
But that can backfire badly, right? Like the King's Cross station fire?
Horrifying example. A small fire started, but ingrained habits, rigid communication channels, reluctance to escalate, sticking to protocol over common sense led to a delayed and ineffective response. Each group followed their own siloed routines. Nobody took overall charge effectively until it was too late.
The habits prevented adaptation and led to disaster.
Tragically, yes. But the flip side is shown by Allison Ward, the nurse at Rhode Island Hospital.
Right, where they introduced checklists and encouraged speaking up.
Exactly. They intentionally disrupted the old habit of deferring to surgeons unquestioningly. They created a new habit using the checklist, empowering anyone to halt the process if something was wrong. Allison, a junior nurse, spoke up, used the checklist routine, and potentially prevented a serious error. New, safer habits replaced old, risky ones.
So organizations can change their habits, often through deliberate structure like checklists. And then there's target predicting pregnancies. That's a different kind of organizational habit using data.
Yeah, that section is eye-opening. Target analyzing guying patterns, unscented lotions, supplements, cotton balls to identify likely pregnant customers, sometimes before their families knew.
Creating a guest portrait to send targeted ads. It's effective, but a bit creepy.
It definitely raises ethical questions. How much should companies know about our habits and how should they use that knowledge? Where's the line between helpful targeting and manipulation?
Good question. And the music industry does something similar, trying to make new songs feel familiar.
Yeah, sandwiching unfamiliar songs between hits on the radio. It taps into our brain's preference for the familiar, makes the new song feel less jarring, more likable, more likely to become a hit, a listening habit. It's leveraging neurological habits for commercial gain.
It seems like understanding these habit mechanisms is a powerful tool, for good or ill. Which brings us to the final part, the neurology and ethics, free will.
Right. Cases like Brian Thomas, the sleepwalker who killed his wife. He wasn't consciously aware, acting out of deep, unconscious patterns. Where does responsibility lie? It gets very complex.
It really challenges our ideas of choice and control. In Angie Bachman's gambling addiction story.
So tragic. It shows how a habit can become pathologically ingrained, driven by neurological cravings that overwhelm conscious desire to stop. The brain scans showing gamblers' brains reacting to near misses like wins. It highlights the biological underpinnings.
It feels almost like the habit loop hijacked her brain.
In a way, yes. But, and this is the crucial final message of the book, habits are not destiny, even these deeply ingrained ones.
Understanding the loop gives us power.
Exactly. Once you understand the cue, routine, reward, the role of craving, willpower, social context, you can start to consciously dissect and reshape your habits. Change is possible. It takes awareness and effort, but the mechanisms can be understood and altered.
So, boiling it all down, the big takeaway from the power of habit is really that framework. Understand the loop, look for keystone habits, tune into cravings, build willpower like a muscle, leverage social support, and you can actually start redesigning your life or even your organization.
That's it in a nutshell. And it starts with awareness. So maybe for everyone listening, think about one habit you have. What's the cue, the routine? What reward are you really getting from it? Just noticing is the first step.
Definitely. So here's a final thought to chew on. Now that we've got this lens, this insight into the hidden forces shaping your day, what's one small deliberate change you could make? One little tweak to a routine, maybe, that could start a ripple effect towards a more intentional future.
Something to think about for sure.
Absolutely. And remember, this deep dive into habit formation was brought to you by Ben's book summaries. Thanks for joining us.